Hello and welcome to the Gaggle where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a short podcast about a very troubling development. Not unexpected, but troubling nonetheless. We know that when the Trump administration came to power a month or so ago, they very ostentatiously made promises that there would be no more government coercion of people's opinions. There would be no more threats to the First Amendment, no more crackdowns on free speech of the kind that we saw during the Biden years. And we know that the Biden administration went out of its way to threaten social media companies to take down opinions and people that the Biden administration looked upon unfavorably. But we knew, and we knew from the experience of Trump's first term, that there was one big glaring exception to this championship of free speech. And of course, that glaring exception was the state of Israel. And that while on other things, whether it's COVID or vaccines or anything else, the Trump administration was perfectly happy with free expression of ideas. It was absolutely unhappy with any free expression of ideas with when it came to the subject of Israel and Palestine. And what then happens is, of course, that these ideas that the Trump administration does not like, and ideas, namely criticisms of Israel and Israeli policy and Israeli government, and the Zionist project as a whole, all of these ideas are then subsumed under this hostile and profoundly inaccurate label of anti-Semitism. So, and of course, anti-Semitism is thoroughly reprehensible because anti-Semitism is hate, and hate that leads to racism and ultimately Nazism and everything else. And so, the Trump administration, during its first incarnation, from 2017 to 2021, had adopted as the definition of anti-Semitism the one put forward by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which was vast and all-encompassing in its definition of anti-Semitism. And of course, it included the criticism of Israel, and namely the expectation that Israel is supposed to adhere to standards that no other country is required to adhere to. This is, of course, completely untrue, but this has always been put forward by Israel apologists, that somehow Israel is being held to a standard that no one else is being held to. Again, it's actually the reverse is the case. Israel gets a free ride where others would come under very harsh criticism. But nonetheless, that's part of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as definition of anti-Semitism. And that's the definition that the Trump administration adopted and has continued to adopt. And so therefore, in its quest to combat anti-Semitism, and Trump, one of his first executive orders on when he became the 47th president was that the federal government would combat anti-Semitism. Now, the problem there is that this is, of course, a fundamental violation of free speech. Whatever you think about the Israel-Palestine issue, there are many views on the matter, and the idea that government will start discriminating about points of view and deem one view meritorious and another reprehensible and worthy of punishment is, of course, thoroughly obnoxious, dictatorial, and clear violation of all free speech standards and a violation of the First Amendment in the United States. But this is what has happened. And we knew from all the noises that were made by Trump that he took particular umbrage at universities, and at universities, which are one of the few institutions in the United States where pro-Palestinian opinion, it gets wide coverage. I mean, most institutions, it's absolutely prohibited, but in universities, there is extensive debate. There are academics in many universities who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Some of them are themselves Palestinians. And so there are, on many university campuses, there's extensive debate on the issue of Israel and Palestine. Seminars, workshops, and protests, usually protests against universities having their endowment invested in arms manufacturers who produce weapons that Israel uses against the Palestinians. And I think that's why there have been protests in many university campuses. They object to university money going to arms manufacturers, and then which then are used by the Israeli government to crush and kill Palestinians. So Trump and his people have protested against these policies and have accused, completely ridiculously, universities for tolerating anti-Semitism. Of course, the university said, no, we just tolerate dissent. We tolerate free speech when it comes to the issue of Israel and Palestine, just like we tolerate free speech when it's Russia and Ukraine. We just allow, different points of view to be presented. However, that Trump and Elise Stefanik and the rest of the people around him take very strong objection to universities permitting this the expression of opinions that are hostile to Israel, and the permitting of campus protests, and which are dubbed anti-Semitism. The problem is that, of course, the federal government wields a great deal of power and can use this power in very menacing ways against universities, because many universities, and particularly the most illustrious of American universities, not necessarily the Ivy League universities, but certainly the Ivy League universities, but those that are not Ivy League, but are nonetheless very, very have huge reputations around the world. They depend on government money. They get an enormous amount of money for research from the Pentagon, from the National Institutes of Health, from the National Science Foundation. And so if the federal government starts threatening the universities because the universities allegedly tolerate anti-Semitism, then that's a very serious business. And it was obvious from the earliest days of this new administration that the government was going to come after these universities, and in particular, Columbia University. And so what's now happened is that the Department of Health and Human Services, which, as we know, is now run by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, as we know, is now a fervent, hysterical Zionist supporter of Israel, a close ally of Rabbi Szamuely, and the Department of Education, now under the tutelage of Linda McMahon, and then the Government Services Administration have now put forward a task force to combat anti-Semitism, and particular the anti-Semitism that they deem is tolerated at universities. And it's clear that their remit is to use the cudgel of withholding funds, large funds, from universities as a means of coercing them to deny the right of pro-Palestinian activists, students, speakers, or whoever. So here was a story that appeared in the New York Times the other day, and you can see the headline, correct headline, which is Trump threatens Colombia with millions in cuts over anti-Semitism claims. The university, the administration's first big target in a campaign to root out what it called harassment on campus, could lose more than 50 million in funding. So again, that's serious money that we're talking about. And it says the Trump administration is threatening to cut tens of millions of dollars in federal funding for Columbia University, making the school the first major target in its effort to root out what it calls anti-Semitic harassment on college campuses. So again, this anti-Semitic harassment, there's been no evidence has been put forward, none whatsoever, that there is any kind of harassment of Jewish students, or that anyone is even expressing anything that's anti-Semitic. It's all come about because the Trump administration, and not just the Trump administration, but this ubiquity of this definition of anti-Semitism that has been put forward by this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, so that what we once thought of as anti-Semitism, which was targeting or harassment of Jews, is now could mean almost anything. I mean, any as Congressman Matt Gaetz said, well, essentially now, if a Bible reading can be deemed anti-Semitic because it talks about Jews crucifying Jesus. So almost anything, and incidentally, that is included within the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. If you argue that it was the Jews that killed Jesus, that is anti-Semitism. So this ridiculous, all-encompassing definition of anti-Semitism has been adopted by the U.S. government, and is now using that definition in order to go after universities, and wielding the enormous clout that the government has to threaten them into silence. It says a comprehensive review of Columbia University's federal contracts and grants was announced on Monday night. So remember, this is quite menacing stuff. A comprehensive review of Columbia University's federal contracts and grants was announced on Monday night, shortly after Linda McMahon was confirmed as the Secretary of Education. And then it says the review, which will be led by the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, and the General Services Administration, has already identified 51.4 million in contracts between Columbia and the federal government that could be subject to stop work orders. Now, these grants that we're talking about have nothing to do with the subject of anti-Semitism. There's nothing to do with the subject of Israel, Palestine, Zionism, whatever. This is just simply punishment of universities for allowing free speech on campus. And says that could be subject. Well, Health and Human Services said in a news release, we're going to take a look at that news release, that the review was necessary given Columbia's ongoing inaction in the face of relentless harassment of Jewish students. Now, again, when they say relentless harassment of Jewish students, the only thing that happens is that not even Jewish students, but that pro-Israel activists, pro-Israel supporters are subjected to hostile uh, uh, notices, hostile speeches about Israel. And the fact that they have to sit and see and listen to speeches that they don't like is deemed harassment of Jewish students. So if you see somebody standing on campus handing out leaflets about Israel Palestine, what's going on in Gaza, that counts as harassment of Jewish students, and it's an absurdity. I mean, the notion that if you hear views that you don't like, that's harassment. That, of course, was the very issue that conservatives used to ridicule the sort of the liberal left. That they're such tender flowers. That they have to that they can't stand having to hear views that they don't like. Oh, they would mock them. That hey, well, put on your big boy pants and accept opinions that you don't like and you don't agree with. But apparently, there's this carve out for Israel. Apparently, Jewish students should not be allowed to hear views about Israel and Gaza that they don't like, and that counts as harassment of Jewish students. And again, I should say it's not about Jewish students, because many Jewish students are themselves actually very active in pro-Palestinian protests. In fact, many Jewish students led the pro-Palestinian protests. So this has nothing to do with Jewishness or non-Jewishness. The only people who felt that they were harassed were, it's not just that they were Jewish, they were just very actively pro-Israeli. You can be that. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't make it out as if somehow you're being subjected to anti-Semitic attacks. Far more could be on the line, says, this is the New York Times. A federal task force will conduct a comprehensive review of the more than $5 billion in federal grant commitments to Columbia University to ensure that the university is in compliance with federal regulations, including its civil rights responsibilities. And then it goes on. Much of that money flows through Columbia's Irving Medical Center, one of the largest academic medical centers in the country. So again, they're threatening to withhold money that's going to this Columbia Irving Medical Center. What has that got to do with Israel, Gaza, whatever? In announcing the review, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the new health secretary, said in a statement, "Anti-Semitism, like racism, is a spiritual and moral malady that sickens society and kills people with lethalities comparable to history's most deadly plagues." Now, this is so stupid, so overwrought, such a ridiculous thing to say, that you really do question, and actually this didn't come up in his confirmation hearings, but it does question Kennedy's seriousness about the issue of public health. I mean, that's your job. Your job as Secretary of Health and Human Services is public health, people's physical health. When you start talking about this spiritual and moral malady that sickens societies and kills people with lethalities comparable to history's most deadly plagues, it doesn't sound like public health is your number one concern. And again, this didn't come up during his confirmation hearings, and it should have done. His very extreme positions that he had taken on Israel was likely to cause some problems as we can see here, where there are now threats to withhold money from a medical research facility, not because it's doing vaccines or doing gender reassignment surgery or whatever, but because it's housed in a university that allows free speech on the issue of Israel and Palestine. And then it says more than a quarter of Colombia's 6.6 billion in annual operating revenue comes from federal sources. That's a lot of money. Of that, about 1.3 billion comes from federal research grants, the category of revenue most immediately at risk from this review. 1.3 billion. Mm-hmm. The National Institutes of Health gives the most federal research money into Colombia, providing 747 million in 2023. And then an additional 206 million came from other health and human services programs. And then here, Colombia is additionally exposed to Trump administration pressure because of the prominence of its pro-Palestinian movement, whose tents overtook the university's grassy quads last spring, giving rise to a wave of encampments nationally. The Trump administration considers many of the chants expressed at pro-Palestinian rallies, such as "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," as anti-Semitic. Exactly. That's the point. It regards this as anti-Semitic. But there's nothing anti-Semitic about it. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but it has nothing, there's nothing one normally thinks of as anti-Semitic, namely that it's targeting Jews simply because they are Jews. That is absolutely not what's going on here. And as I said, many of the leading voices during the protests last year, many of the leading pro-Palestinian voices, many of the people leading the protests were themselves Jews. They were Jewish students. So that that therefore you'd have to say, well, these Jews are anti-Semitic. It's obviously nonsensical. The 3 investigations into anti-Semitism at Colombia are underway, all triggered by a Trump executive order to combat anti-Semitism. They include a Department of Justice task force dedicated to rooting out anti-Semitism that is initially focused on 10 universities. So that again, we had warning that Pam Bondi, the new Attorney General, that she's going to do this. The school is also among 5 universities being examined in a Department of Education investigation into anti-Semitism. And according to the Wall Street Journal, is among 4 medical schools named in a Health and Human Services investigation into anti-Semitism. So again, so they're going after medical schools. Medical schools, they haven't done anything. They have nothing to do whatever with the Middle East. They're just being punished because they're housed in a university that the government is not happy with. And then here we have this Gil's the loss of this is a professor of electrical engineering at Columbia, Gil Sussman. And he says the loss of federal funding would be devastating. And then he's been calling for Colombia to take more aggressive action to protect Jewish and Israeli students from protesters who break rules. The crisis should be used by the Colombia leadership to make immediate changes related to enhancing and enforcing the university rules, despite objections from a vocal minority of faculty, most of whom do not rely on federal funding for research. So, he's saying there, well, I need this federal funding, which he probably does. He's professor of electrical engineering, so I'm sure that they're getting engineering departments get a lot of money from the federal government, and says, hey, I need my money. So it's up to the Columbia administration to crack down on speech rather than, which is what one would hope a university professor would say, namely that it's against the U.S. Constitution. It's a violation of the First Amendment for the government to be engaging in viewpoint discrimination, of saying, well, you can have some money because you have views that are in alignment with the federal government, but you can't have any money because your views are not in alignment with the federal government. I mean, that is a blatant violation of the First Amendment. It's viewpoint discrimination. Clearly, the governments cannot do that. Whether it's federal governments, state governments, local governments, whatever, they cannot do that. And then Dr. Brent Stockwell, the chair of the Department of Biological Sciences, said that threatening research funding was exactly the wrong lever for the Trump administration to pull to fight anti-Semitism, in part because many Jewish faculty members will lose their jobs if their funding is eliminated. They just don't understand that if they wipe out all the Jewish researchers who are doing frontier cutting-edge research, that would just make things more difficult, said Dr. Stockwell, who is Jewish. It's adding salt to the wound. I mean, that's okay. I mean, what he's saying there is no doubt true, but that isn't really the issue. Even if non-Jewish faculty and members and students would lose their jobs because of a cut in grants, it would still be wrong. It's not the issue that whether they're Jewish or not doesn't really make any difference. It's the fact that the government is engaging in viewpoint discrimination. Anyway, what's here is Trump. He sent out this truth. He says all federal funding will stop for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protests. Of course, he doesn't spell out here what does he mean by illegal protest, because he obviously means, hey, we're now committed to combating anti-Semitism. We're going to take our definition of anti-Semitism from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and therefore the protests that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance deems to be anti-Semitic will be illegal because the federal government has adopted that definition of anti-Semitism. So it's illegal, and therefore all federal funding will stop to any college, school, or university that allows these protests. So, anyone who any college, school, or university that permits the free expression of ideas, which is supposedly what universities are there to do, and which we've been told by conservatives. I don't know how many times you go on Laura Ingraham and you go to Sean Hannity and the whole lineup at Fox News, all pretending to be in favor of academic freedom, in favor of free speech. Conservatives are being persecuted at universities. Now it turns out that they don't really favor free speech, because if free speech means criticism of Israel, then include them out. They definitely do not support that. In fact, on the contrary, they favor government using its powers of coercion to pressure universities to crack down on free speech. Agitators will be imprisoned. Right? Well, that's an interesting one. Who will be imprisoned? I mean, is it people who will express what the Trump administration deems as anti-Semitic views? Agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. Expelled for what? Arrested for what? Agitators. I mean, to do what? All we're talking about here is protest. And of course, Trump is being quite cunning, because because you read this and you think, oh well, obviously he means people who engage in violence. That's not what he's saying here. There's nothing he's not saying anyone who engages in violence will be arrested. That would be one thing. But that's not what he's saying. There's illegal protest. And we know, illegal, what he means by illegal. Agitators. Why, since when is agitating a crime worthy of imprisonment? No masks. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So here, an open threat against college, schools, and universities for permitting the expression of ideas that the Trump administration deems to be illegal. And then here we have, this is the Kennedy's Department of Health and Human Services that issued this news release. It says here, HHS, ED, GSA announced additional measures to end anti-Semitic harassment on college campuses. And then today, the Department of Health and Human Services, Education, the General Services Administration announced a comprehensive review of Columbia University's federal contracts and grants in light of ongoing investigations for potential violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Comprehensive review, Columbia University's federal contracts and grants. And so what is the basis of this review that that somehow the government can withhold contracts and grants somehow, it's the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So again, they're talking here about that's something they're permitting anti-Semitism. Given Columbia's ongoing inaction in the face of relentless harassment of Jewish students, again, relentless harassment, again, completely unable to bring up one example of a Jewish student being harassed just for being Jewish, which is what we normally think of as anti-Semitism. The federal government's task force to combat anti-Semitism is considering stop work orders for $51.4 million in contracts between Columbia University and the federal government. The task force will also conduct a comprehensive review of the more than $5 billion in federal grant commitments to Columbia University to ensure the university is in compliance with federal regulation, including its civil rights responsibilities. $5 billion, that's quite a whack that they're reviewing. So if you're an administrator in Columbia and you're threatened with losing so much money, I mean, this is what the major universities in America live off. They live off these grants from the federal government. You threaten to withhold that, and you soon jump to attention. Anti-Semitism, like racism, spiritual moral. This is Bobby Kennedy again, and then he goes on. In recent years, the censorship and false narrative of woke cancel culture have transformed our great universities into greenhouses for this deadly and virulent pestilence. So this is the anti-Semitism. What on earth is that any of that to do with anything? What censorship and false narratives of woke cancel culture? Doubtless this is something for the Republican base, the MAGA crowd, that say, well, woke, we don't like woke and cancel culture. What has any of that got to do with the Palestinian cause, or with the Israel or Gaza or anything like that? Virulent pestilence. No, notice again, he's trying to make this a health issue. He had this using this word about the deadly plagues. Now it's virulent pestilence. This is completely ridiculous, way over the top, overwrought language about views he doesn't like. There's nothing to do, if he could actually cite serious anti-Semitism, then we can at least discuss this, whether it's appropriate to use this biological language. But by using essentially this biological language of diseases and pestilence and virulence, he is sounding like the anti-Semite, the classic anti-Semite through the ages, who would talk about pestilence and plagues and greenhouses and hothouses, in which this plague thrives. But they would use that kind of language to talk about Jews. So Kennedy is using this overwrought, hate-filled language about plagues and pestilence and bacteria and viruses, essentially to induce hatred towards whom? Towards those who are, advocating on behalf of the Palestinians. So he's the one who's using this I don't know, I think frightening kind of language to whip up hatred. Making America healthy, again, making America healthy, so that you're making healthy by removing this pestilence of views I don't like. Making America healthy means building communities of trust and mutual respect based on speech freedom and open debate. So you're cracking down on free speech, you're cracking down on debate, and then you say that you're doing it all in the spirit of speech freedom and open debate. This is exactly the language used by the censors in Europe, by all the Ursula von der Leyens and the Thierry Breton. You use exactly this language to justify cracking down on free speech, cracking down on social media. It's all in the spirit of encouraging free and open debate. The task force review is the first major action announced from the multi-agency task force to combat anti-Semitism created by President Trump's executive order. And then here we have Linda McMahon. Americans have watched in horror for more than a year now as Jewish students have been assaulted and harassed on elite university campuses. Again, untrue. There's none. All of this has been made up. We went through each of these examples when they claimed that Jewish students were assaulted and harassed on elite university campuses. It didn't happen. Unlawful encampments and demonstrations have completely paralyzed day-to-day campus operations, depriving Jewish students of learning opportunities to which they are entitled. Why are they talking? Let's say it was true that unlawful encampments and demonstrations paralyzed day-to-day campus operations, and as a result, students were not able to go to classes, they weren't able to attend lectures, they weren't able to go to the library, and write the essays and class papers or whatever. Let's say that's true. And that's a reasonable issue, because after all, the students are paying a lot of money to attend these universities, and they want to be able to do their work, and that's fine. Then you can say, well, there has to be some kind of order on campus so that the students who are not interested in the in this issue are still able to carry on with their studies. That's a fair criticism. But when he says Jewish students, why are you singling out Jewish students? Why is it only matters that Jewish students were not able to attend classes, were not able to go to the laboratories, or weren't able to go to the library and write their essays and whatever? Why is it only them? Why, if you want to criticize university administration, that by allowing encampments on campus prevented students from carrying out their studies, then that's fair enough, and that's a reasonable issue. But if you single out Jewish students, then you think, well, something else is going on here. You are trying to suggest that there was some kind of an anti-Semitic intent when there wasn't. It may be that these encampments hampered student studies. Now, maybe that happened, though I haven't seen any compelling arguments that anyone was actually prevented from attending classes or prevented from going to the library or the laboratory or whatever. I haven't seen any evidence of that. But they want to make it out that the intent was to prevent Jewish students from carrying out their studies. And that, is obviously a fraud. Because if there was really a problem with the proper functioning of the university campus, then that would affect all students. But she doesn't talk about, all students. Instead, she wants to suggest that Jewish students were somehow prevented from engaging in their studies. Institutions that receive federal funds have a responsibility to protect all students from discrimination. So what is the discrimination? Where's the discrimination? So again, she's trying to suggest that Jewish students were not able to attend classes. Well, show me the proof. Show me the proof. The Jewish students alone were not able to go to classes. Jewish students were not able to go to the laboratories or the libraries or whatever. Show me any proof of that. There's no evidence of that. But she's saying, oh, this was discrimination. She does this in this very deceitful way to suggest that this was a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Total lie. But that's how they're trying to do this, to fool the public, that somehow if you permit free speech on campus, you are in violation of the Civil Rights Act. Colombia's apparent failure to uphold their end of this basic agreement raises a very serious questions about the institution's fitness to continue doing business with the United States government. Look at this ridiculous language, but definitely menacing. GSA, this is the Government Services Administration, has been asked to facilitate the review of federal funding received by Colombia, including grant and contract reviews across the federal government. GSA remains committed to upholding federal acquisition standards and ensuring that government contracts reflect our nation's values, including the fight against anti-Semitism. This is, FAS Commissioner and Task Force member Josh Grunbaum. With this partnership, we'll be working across government and so on to end the culture of anti-Semitism. What culture? There's no culture of anti-Semitism. I mean, this is, again, this is what happens. You come up with this phony, fraudulent definition of anti-Semitism from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and then you can just keep repeating it as if somehow there is indeed such a thing as anti-Semitism and is rampant across America. Apparently, this all over America, the anti-Semitism is prevailing. And then we have, this is Kennedy. He won't let it go. Kennedy says here, and this is the same thing is here that he had already issued in that public service announcement. And then here, this is from the Education Department, which says measures will include a comprehensive review of federal contract grants given to institutions to combat anti-Semitic violence. And that's violence. Imagine you've now suddenly you've gone from the expressions of anti-Semitism, the virulence of anti-Semitism, the pestilence of anti-Semitism, the culture of anti-Semitism. Now there's anti-Semitic violence. Where was that? When did that happen? And then here again, this is repeat the same. And then, given Colombia's ongoing inaction in the face of relentless harassment of Jewish students, I mean, again, you just move from one thing to another, and you still have presented no evidence that any of that ever happened. Relentless harassment of Jewish students, the federal government's task force to combat anti-Semitism is considering the stop work orders, and then again, we'll just conduct this review, and then so this again, Linda McMahon, we're saying the same thing here, and yeah, we've seen all that. So this is, the Trump administration, as we knew it would carve out this huge exception for free speech when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And of course, the conservatives are all clapping their hands with glee, and all the Make America First, and all the MAGA crowd also clapping their hands with glee, and somehow suggesting that by cracking down on the free expression of opinion, they're fighting ISIS. Oh, it's apparently these people who are expressing anti-Israel views or pro-Palestinian views, they're the same as ISIS. That's who is being hit. And so this is part of the global war on terror, and therefore you're hitting the jihadis and the Hamas terrorists. That's what this is all about. That's what people like Steve Bannon and all the people in Bannon world will repeat. And in order to get everyone online, and suddenly, hey, I thought you were for free speech. Now apparently you're in favor of throwing people in prison. Well, yeah, but those are jihadis that we're throwing in prison. No, these are not jihadis. These are people who are are very, very unhappy with Israeli policy in Gaza, Israeli policy in the West Bank, in fact, Israeli policy for in the Middle East for many, many years. And again, whatever you think about that, and this is really nothing even to do with any of that. You can't have government using its coercive powers to stamp out speech that it doesn't like. And it's an obvious point, and that's what the Trump administration is threatening to do. And it's lamentable that the conservatives, who were supposedly these champions of free speech, and who for years, were mocking the kind of liberal leftish students for their sort of wilting flowers that they can't take the bracing fresh air of vigorous debate, that there's too much for them. Now apparently they can't do it. In fact, they can't take the vigorous bracing air of free debate, and they have to be protected from that. It just shows that their only problem with the suppression of free speech is that they didn't like the suppression of their speech. They didn't like the suppression of speech liked by conservatives, but they're perfectly happy with the suppression of speech that they don't like. So this conservative hypocrisy is really quite disgusting. Anyway, that's my podcast. It went on for a little bit longer than I'd expected, but it's very much worth paying attention to. So thank you for joining me, and remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon.